Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. This is David Bianco. Well, we've got 3 more releases from the Atlantic 75th series from Analogue Productions here on August 9th, 2024. And I'm going to review one of those against the original US release and a Japanese cut as well. And the album? Foreigner 4. Now, Foreigner 4 was the 4th LP released by Foreigner on July 3rd, 1981. And for 10 weeks, it was #1 on the US Billboard charts, with sales topping 6 million copies in the US. Now, the working title of this album was actually called Silent Partners, but it was changed to 4 when it became obvious that they'd gone down to 4 people in the band from 6, and this was their 4th album. So they brought those 2 ideas together to give this title. Now, the band had gone down to Mick Jones on guitar, keyboards, and backing vocals, Lou Gramm, vocals and percussion, Dennis Elliott, drums and backing vocals, and Rick Wills on bass and backing vocals. One of the people that was involved in the recording of this, which added a lot of synthesizers, was actually Thomas Dolby. And that great sax solo that you heard on Urgent, that was Junior Walker from Junior Walker and the All-Stars fame. Now, the first 3 records and their driving hard rock image had been softened some on Foreigner 4, moving a little more popish. Now, the first 3 singles that were released off this album were Urgent, which hit #1 on the Billboard mainstream rock chart, but only made it to #4 on the Hot 100 of Billboard. The second single was Waiting for a Girl Like You, which also hit #1 on the Billboard mainstream chart and snuck up to #2 on the Hot 100 chart, but didn't make it to #1. And then the third single release was Jukebox Hero, and it was actually the weakest single off of the album. It only made it to #3 on that Billboard mainstream rock chart, and it faltered at the Billboard Hot 100, only making it to #26. Now, here's a fun fact. These are 2 different Billboard charts, and they operated very differently. The mainstream rock chart rated songs when the LP was first released, judging the amount of airplay those songs got off of the LP in the FM market. Whereas the Billboard Hot 100 was solely based on 45 RPM 7-inch single releases, which were often associated then with airplay on AM radio. So for example, while Jukebox Hero got to #3 on that mainstream rock chart, that play ranking occurred when the album first came out in July of '81, when the LP was released. But the 45 RPM 7-inch single of that song didn't get released until early 1982. And it's possible that the amount of play that song had gotten over the last 6 months had worn down interest in the song, thus the fact that it scored so poorly on the Hot 100. So for my shootout, the entries that I have are a US original first pressing. This mastering was done by George Marino at Sterling, and the record I have was pressed at Specialty Records Pressings. I have a Japanese first pressing, and this first variant used potentially a mastering engineer from Japan. It definitely was not the second variant, which had stampers that were actually from the US, and you could tell that they were done by Sterling. So mine is actually what Japan had put out and mastered itself. There's no credits on there to say who it was. There's some initials, TO. I haven't been able to find what that associates to. But I want to be clear that there are 2 Japanese pressings of this. One which is a mirror essentially of the US release, but the early one first came out and didn't use the stampers from the US. They became available later. So the first pressing actually is done via mastering in Japan. And of course, The one we're shooting out against is the newly released Analogue Productions 2x45RPM. It was mastered directly from the original master tape by Ryan K. Smith at Sterling Sound, pressed at Quality Records Pressings, QRP, at Chad's place. And of course, it has a great tip-on style gatefold double pocket jacket from Stoughton. So, you know, the usual good stuff that comes. I haven't even cracked mine yet. Very sweet. Got all the lyrics in there. These are very robust, very well done. And of course, for subscribers, you have a number there. 308 is my number. So all of my records that come from this series have that 308 on there. Now, the breakup of the songs for this on the 45 RPM 2 LP, so you have 4 sides. So side 1 has Nightlife, Jukebox Hero, Break It Up. Side 2 has Waiting for a Girl Like You and Luann. Side 3 has Urgent and I'm Gonna Win. And then side 4 has Woman in Black, Girl on the Moon, and Don't Let Go. Now, the 3 songs that I focused on the most in my listening were the ones that were more popular: Jukebox Hero, Waiting for a Girl Like You, and Urgent, of course. And they are the ones that I formulated most of my raw comparisons against. And there clearly were some differences in these records. And that's why we buy these, you know, to check out what improved. How did it get better? How good is the OG? Is the Japanese a better sound and a quieter vinyl, and all of these kind of paradigms we have. So the first validation I did was to take the original against the Japanese. It had been a long time since I listened to that Japanese. I bought it when this album came out, along with the OG. There was an Audiophile store in Houston that carried a lot of these imports that came in. And Japanese pressings were typically very quiet, and they sounded good, and most sounded a little brighter than the US, and sometimes lacked a bit of the bass. So this comparison I thought was a good starting point to pick a winner, so to speak, between those two. And in doing so, and making the comparisons right out of the box, and I think the first track I actually validated was Urgent, it was very apparent to me that the OG very much had a very full sound stage, very good highs and impact and bass and kick drum, and you know, voice sounded very solid and strong on it. But the Japanese, ironically, did not. It really lacked some top end. Again, it's the old, did someone throw a towel over my speaker and the tweeter's not, I'm not hearing the tweeter kind of sound. And the bass was not as strong as the OG. Now, just through paradigm, we kind of expect the bottom end not to be as impactful on a Japanese pressing. But the top end being weak, that's pretty rare. And I'm sure that if you got a Japanese pressing of the actual plates that were used at Sterling, and that, because there's, if you look on Discogs, it shows 2 variants of that, and the second variant has the very same imprints basically that are matching from the OG from the US. It probably sounds a lot better, but this Japanese version was poor, and you know, it's kind of like take it off, don't want to listen to it. Just doesn't, it's just missing way too much, which is unusual. Now, the vinyl was quiet. It was virgin vinyl. Even had a sticker on there that said that. But again, you weren't getting the full presentation of the album. So the Japanese was easily eliminated. So we were down to the US original versus the Atlantic 75th Analogue Productions 2x45. And these were much, much closer. A lot closer in range of sound. You had the highs, you had the bottom end, you had the good voice. So they were very comparable in many ways. So it was a good way to shoot them out. So my impressions of what I heard was that the OG is no slouch. It is no slouch at all. So, if you have an OG, it's very, very presentable, in my opinion, of what was recorded. Where the distinctions came about are in a couple of areas. I would say that the voice of Lou Gramm, which is to me a very, very important part of Foreigner's sound, was much more clear and laser-like with the Analogue Productions. I thought the voice definitely carried better and stuck out more from the instrumentation. You could hear the voice well in the OG, but it was overridden a bit and blended in a bit more with the music, whereas on the Analogue Productions, it had a more distinctive sound to it and more of a presence, as did some of the airiness, let's say, of a song like Waiting for a Girl Like You, with the synthesizers and some of that open echo voice of Lou Gramm. Those opened up on the Analogue Productions. That was probably one of the more distinct differences that I would say happened. Part of the reason for that to some degree might be that the Analogue Productions didn't have quite as low of a bass, but it was very accurate. And so the OG, the bass was there, but it was a little muddled, a little messy, and it really, I think maybe in some ways took away from being able to distinguish some of that mid-range. And therefore, it was almost a bit too much when you compared it. Now, good driving songs, Jukebox Hero, Urgent. Yeah, it definitely has that punch, and the AP had the punch as well. It just had a little more punch of precision, and it wasn't, I guess I would say, overdone. And it really was more comfortable to listen to the sound stage with that level of bottom end. Whereas the OG seemed just to push it a bit, and in doing so, I think it impacted some of the other aspects of what you were listening to in terms of how clear it was, how good it was within the sound stage and the imaging of the record. And so, although it really had good energy, it didn't quite have the same level of precision of hearing things, instruments distinctly, voices distinctly. Some of those top notes on some of the synthesizers were a little cleaner on the AP, I would say. So it was definitely one where the OG definitely has a lot of credibility. It has a really, really decent sound. But when you have something else to compare it to, and it is able to bring about some of these distinctions, you gain an appreciation for some of what was going on in the recording and in the musicianship that gets a little lost in the OG. And that's kind of generally, in most cases, what I've been finding with these recuts that have been done by Analogue Productions in this Atlantic 75th series. Let's get down to the rankings. So I think you pretty well get the sequence in terms of the winners and the losers, so to speak. So they're listed here. We've got the Analogue Productions 2x45, Ryan K. Smith on top, and the USOG by George Marino second, and then the Japanese OG with the unknown mastering engineers last. So let's look at how the numbers came to be. Quiet Vinyl, we give a 9.5 to the Analogue Productions. Extremely, extremely quiet. No doubt about it. Could easily be a 10, but being a hard grader, we'll make it a 9.5 on that. USOG, mine's a little bit noisy. I'm sure that varies by record in terms of maybe the pressing plant or how well it's been kept up, obviously. But I gave mine a 7.5, so definitely noisier across the board, especially in some of the quieter passages. And then the Japanese, now it had a 9. It was strong. It wasn't quite as quiet as the Analogue Productions, but as is usually the case for Japanese pressings, pretty darn quiet pressing overall. Moving into the sound aspects, we get to the bass, and the bass here, On the AP, we gave a 9.5, and we gave the OG a 10. Now, I think although the number is a bit lower on the AP, the bass is a little cleaner, but just from an impact of bass, the OG had a little more punch to it, although that added some muddiness that you're going to see in some of the other numbers reflected on maybe where it affected it. But I'd say that's my aspect of looking at it from which one had the most punch perspective. And the Japanese was a 7. Of course, those are typically not great in the bottom end. We kind of expect that. Moving on to the mids, I think the voice aspects and the ability to really get instrumentation clarification in the AP was a 10. It was very strong, very easy to discriminate the voices and to discriminate the sounds of the instruments in that there. And the OG was a little more muddled in that area. It wasn't bad, but it just definitely... It's one of those things, honestly, I probably would have gave it like a 9 or 9.5 if I hadn't heard the AP. But in relative terms, it makes the distinction more obvious when you do these back-to-back shootouts. So I gave that an 8.5 for the mids on the OG, and the same on the Japanese. It had some areas there where it wasn't nearly as precise as the Analogue Productions. We get to the treble, a 10 for the AP, very, very precise treble, very smooth in a way, not annoyingly bright, and giving you really a good understanding of how the cymbal work was done and how some of the higher notes of the synthesizers went. The solo sax on Urgent really reed. You could really hear the reed being blown through on that on the very high end there. Very well done. It's pretty good on the US, a 9. But again, comparing the two, the AP ran away with it a bit, and so you didn't quite get quite as much precision on the US. And then the Japanese was a 5. I mean, that's the lowest I've ever rated anything. But to be honest, it was just, the treble was just amazingly missing. Very, very disappointing and surprising. I mean, I haven't listened honestly to that Japanese pressing in a long time, but I was surprised at how nil it was in the ability to reproduce those upper frequencies. So that's a new world's record in the wrong way, giving it a 5. We come to imaging, and that type of arena, the imaging and the space that you hear and the openness. The AP was just glorious in that regard, and really showed on like Waiting for a Girl Like You, where you have some softer areas and more echo in the sound, and the ability to really pick up on the depth and the breadth of the vocals of Lou Gramm, which is really what a lot of these are all about, in my opinion. And gave it a 9 for the USOG. It was pretty strong there, but again, the comparison showed that there was more to eke out, and Ryan K. Smith did just that. And it was pretty decent on the Japanese, but again, it was a step below the USOG in the imaging area. And the voices, same kind of thing. The voice clarity, definitely a 10 for the AP, a 9 for the US, and 8 for the Japanese. Those had similar kind of characteristics. So we come down to a total there where the AP out of 10 was 9.83. The US was an 8.92. And the Japanese a 7.5. Pretty low, with, of course, that treble rating of 5 really drawing it down. One thing I do in the calculations and rankings, and I go back and I say, well, what if we take out the quietness of the vinyl? Sometimes there's some that distinction is so great that maybe a record that sounds pretty good, it gets a really big negative on the quiet vinyl and jumps up a spot or something. But in this case, it really didn't affect anything. It brought the USOG actually up to a 9.2, which you would expect because it had a 7.5 on the quiet vinyl, and that dragged down its number to 8.9. And then by eliminating that 7.5, the actual musicality range got it to a 9.2. But again, it's still a bit behind there, the 9.9 of the AP. And then rounding it out to 7.3 for the Japanese. Because that 5 blew it down so low on the treble, there was nothing here that could really revive this particular one whatsoever. So that's the end of that on that one. I think I know which one I'm going to be putting on the selling block, that's for sure. So anyway, that's how things rounded out on this one. It was really a good experience, and again, the AP had some real strengths that really were made known, auditorily by comparing it to the OG, which the OG was pretty darn strong. But there were areas where the AP just shone in so many ways that you recognize there was a delta, there was a gap between what could be the best versus the OG, which sounded pretty darn good. And again, that's kind of what we're seeing with this series as we've gone through it. That's kind of the MO, or the modus operandi, of these particular pressings that are coming out of Analogue Productions. So thanks to Chad and the gang there at QRP and everybody involved, Ryan K. Smith at Sterling, getting this one done. Really a stellar job and well worth having. If you really like this album, it's definitely the best one I've heard. So as always, thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please consider doing so by pressing on the bell for those notifications. And a thumbs up or like is appreciated, as are your comments. So until we meet again, thanks for joining me on our Safe and Sound Texas audio excursion. Take care, everybody.